In 2023, the Writers Guild of America, which represents over 11,000 screenwriters, went on strike. Now, one of the central areas of dispute between the Writers Guild of America and the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers were residuals related to streaming services. Now, ultimately, the strikers were successful. The work stoppage culminated after 148 days of industrial action and an estimated $6.5 billion lost to the Californian economy, with a new agreement which was ratified by the Screenwriters Guild of America's members. However, that is not the end of the story. In a recent piece published in Harper's magazine entitled The Life and Death of Hollywood, Associate Professor of History at the University of Washington's Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies, Daniel Bessner argues that film and television writers continue to face an existential threat. I'm Djene Badgelan.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
And you're listening to Talking History.
Dr. Bessner, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you for having me.
So before we discuss how the film and television industry has changed over the last few decades and why writers continue to be under threat despite their apparent victory in the 2023 strike, let's step back and begin by taking the long view. In your piece, you note, greed is not new to Hollywood. The well-off career we associate with 20th century screenwriting came about from a combination of worker action and federal regulation. Can you provide the context for how this mid-20th century settlement came into being and what it meant for writers?
Sure. So the first major period of Hollywood history is often referred to as the studio system, which broadly speaking referred to the fact that labor was existed under contract with studios. So for example, let's say MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, would hire a bunch of writers, a bunch of actors, and they would serve on the staff of the studio. And these writers would write a bunch of movies, and the actors would act in a bunch of movies, and they were on contract. For a variety of reasons that I go into the article, in the 1930s, really beginning in 1933, an association of writers known as the Screenwriters Guild transformed over the course of the 1930s into an officially recognized union. Still called the Screenwriters Guild. It becomes the WGA, Writers Guild of America, I believe in 1954. But in effect, the union was able to negotiate a contract with these studios in 1942 is when it goes into effect. And things existed as they did in the studio system, with writers and actors being on salary, but subject to this negotiated agreement. In 1948, something happens. The Supreme Court issues these things called the Paramount Decrees, which essentially force the traditional studios, which were vertically integrated, they controlled production, distribution, and exhibition, to divest themselves of their exhibition businesses, i.e. movie theaters. There were several reasons for this, but in brief, it was an antitrust ruling. And so the studios basically divested themselves of the movie theater chains that they owned. And over the course of the 1950s, the studios, being a bit less flush with cash, began to no longer prefer salaried workers, but instead began to prefer freelance workers. So this tensions rise over the course of the 1950s, and to make a long story short, as the result of a 1960 strike that occurred as the result of a 1960 strike that the WGA, the Writers Guild, and the Screen Actors Guild, SAG, two strikes basically happened at the same time. It's oftentimes referred to as a dual strike, but I believe wasn't technically so. But anyway, strike resulted in a concordat with the studios, in which the studios basically agreed to give things like residuals on movies that were broadcast, for movies that were broadcast on television, or TV shows that were rerun, and also began to contribute health and pension benefits to the writers and the actors. So in effect, as a result of the strike, kind of the employment relationship of the studio system was created, at least in minimum. So writers weren't actually contracted by the studios any longer, but they did have some traditional benefits of salaried work. And that has essentially been the structure that has defined Hollywood since the 1960s.
So you note in the article that the kind of guardrails that undergirded this system that protected writers began to break down in the 1980s as a result of the Reagan Revolution of deregulation. However, one of the interesting aspects of your article is that it seems that there's a kind of paradoxical or even contradictory effect of this change in regulation. It seems, for example, in the short term, deregulation opened up some new options for writers, new opportunities for writers, led to money flowing into the system. But those same processes that offered those opportunities in the longer term had more negative consequences. And obviously this begins with Reagan, but continues throughout the 90s under the administration of Bill Clinton. So can you account for what was this deregulation, and what accounts for this kind of paradox between kind of short-term gains for writers in movies and then the longer-term kind of beggaring of the writer industry?
Well, in some sense, it's just capitalism. So there was some truth to the free market argument that when you got rid of all guardrails on a free and made the system more quote unquote free market, even though, as Djene, you and I know, there's no such thing as a free market. These things are always shaped by state power, and what industries are affected in what ways is actually, governed by political power to a large degree. That's the political and political economy. But it was true that when deregulation happened, more money began to flow through the system, and that actually led, in the short term, for a variety of reasons. You had executives that really did care about movies. There was less an emphasis on intellectual property, even though that was really starting to happen in the 1980s. But studios would pay writers to do a lot of development. Studios would pay writers to do things like write scripts. And even if they never used that script, a writer could make a living in Hollywood, or there was something called a writing career that one could presumably make a living on. Not presumably that one could make a living off of. Particularly, writers were also aided by things like residuals in television and movies, which were quite large and could keep them going through the downtimes. And so the 1980s and 1990s are roughly good periods for writers. Nevertheless, the 1980s and 1990s also witness the reemergence of gigantic corporations. Really, behemoths turn into leviathans, and you get the further consolidation of the media and entertainment industry in these large conglomerates over the course of the 80s and the 90s. And so this is almost part of the dialectic of capitalism, that as this quote unquote good thing is happening, which is that there's money that studios are paying to have writers write scripts, and people could earn middle class or upper middle class or even wealthy livings by being Hollywood screenwriters in film and TV. The seeds of that downfall of that profession are coming with the conglomeration. And then this conglomeration, maybe I'll just leave here. By the early 2000s, Hollywood is a very monopolized industry. A small number of companies basically control most film and most television. And that's the condition we found ourselves in the early to mid 2000s.
And just to follow up on that, when you talk about the kind of consolidation that was taking place, the sort of the old system before the 1980s, antitrust law had been used to break up these monopolies, but with deregulation, your article points out that the federal government decided not to enforce these antitrust laws, and that precipitated. So technically, on the books, there are still laws that could break up these monopolies, but they weren't enforced. Is that correct?
Yeah, right. The FCC determines how to interpret legal regulation, and the FCC could take a stronger or weaker hand toward regulation. And in effect, in the 1980s, the Reagan era FCC decided that it would no longer enforce elements of antitrust law. And these laws are, not all of them, but a lot of them are further taken off the books in the over the course of the 1980s and 1990s anyway, with various acts passed related to cable, the repeal of these financial interest and syndication laws that had begun in the early 1970s but are repealed in the early 1990s, which have to do with whether it's profitable for movie studios to own cable networks and things like that. And then, of course, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which essentially removes a lot of the guardrails in terms of ownership and media conglomeration. So that happens. And also, of course, finance itself begins to become deregulated. And so you get the rise of new financial tools, things like hedge funds, private equity, large scale index funds, which really take off in the 2000s and the 2010s as part of the American economy, particularly after the 2008 Great Recession, when a lot of capital was pumped into the system, which really helped these certain types of new financial institutions and groups. Who, began to invest in Hollywood, partially because there were fewer places to profitably invest in the American economy. And I think this is a part of the article that a lot of people missed. But really, from my understanding, is that Hollywood's not a very good business if you're these large-scale financial firms. It's a business of hits. There's a lot of misses. There's a lot of lost investment. There usually marginal returns aren't that gigantic, certainly when compared to investing in Uber early. Investing in a particular movie is never going to result in a gigantic windfall. But one of the reasons that finance floods into Hollywood, in particular, the entertainment industry, is that there's fewer places for them to invest. Like, you're not building American cities in the same way you were in, let's say, the 19th or early 20th or even into the mid 20th century. So capital is looking for new places to go. And then once capital begins to enter Hollywood, as there's fewer and fewer places to make a profit in the American political economy, it does what it always does, is that it starts cutting costs. It starts trying to squeeze labor. It destroys a relatively healthy business model of cable in order to create streaming, with the goal being, the monopolization of all television watching, and to a lesser degree movie watching. And that's really the story of the last 15 or so years, this era of peak TV, and one might also add prestige TV, which overlapped.
So you've mentioned a couple of times now the early 2000s as a turning point, and identified 2008, the financial crisis, as particularly important to that, as a moment when things were changing. How did that crisis reshape the film industry, and what did it mean for writers?
Well, you get basically, initially it was quite good for writers, because the rise of the streaming business, which I think is partially, at least culturally, connected to the deregulation of cable and the rise of a lot of cable networks, the emergence of a lot more cable networks over the course of the 1990s and 2000s, which helped lead to the development of scripted TV on cable television, which wasn't always the case. Well, there had been always scripted programs on cable, but it really started to explode famously with The Sopranos and Sex and the City in the late 1990s. But also a bunch of other networks started to do scripted television at around that time. And so you begin to create an audience for scripted television that existed. Obviously, people watched network TV, but an audience for cable scripted television, which had kind of different norms than network scripted television. And so by the time you get a streamer like Netflix promising to disrupt the television game in the late 2000s and early 2010s, there's this hunger for content. And so that, coupled with the rise of prestige television, again, like the shows I mentioned, The Sopranos, to a lesser degree Sex and the City, but really The Wire, and later Breaking Bad, and the first season of Homeland. In particular, there's this idea that writers could not only make money in Hollywood, which, there's an old story of playwrights and novelists going to Hollywood to cash in, but that writers could actually do really great art. Mad Men, another obvious, golden era TV show, it seemed to demonstrate that you could have like artistic pretensions and still make money and do good art. And so you have that interest. There was an elected affinity between writers wanting to get paid and make good art, and streaming services in their search for monopoly desire for more content in order to increase their subscription base. So you get this golden age of television, of quote unquote peak TV, where the sort of proverbial show that no one's ever heard of, but is starring, some famous-ish celebrity, and that happens toward the mid to late 2010s, is an artifact of this political economic process. Now, of course, this all comes to a crashing end in April 2022, but for about a decade, there was a gold rush of a lot of TV being produced, a lot of interesting shows that would normally not be green-lighted, and it probably wouldn't have been green-lighted earlier, are also being produced, and you get this, era of peak TV. Now, I think there still remains work to be done on the actual content of these shows, whether these shows were good or not good or what they reflected, blah, blah, blah. I kind of put that to the side in my article. But this all comes to a crashing halt, as I already mentioned, April 2022, when Netflix announces that for the first time it has lost subscribers and it expected to lose more. And moreover, at around the same time, the Fed started raising interest rates, so there's less cheap money. So again, you have these two things happening. Netflix says we're not constantly growing, and the Fed raises interest rates. So you see a precipitous decline in the stock prices of a lot of the major media conglomerates, which again are like at this point super duper gigantic. For example, Disney, I think starting in 2009, it acquires Marvel. I think it earlier acquired Pixar. It acquires Lucasfilm, i.e. Star Wars, 20th Century Fox. So you get these gigantic companies so that they control market power, but now the streaming services need to start making money. So you get a basically decline in jobs for writers, which helps engender the strike that occurred in 2023, sort of late spring 2023 to early autumn.
Now, one of the things you talk about with the rise of streaming especially in the 2010s is a kind of interesting dynamic. As you already kind of pointed out, there are new opportunities for writers to, have stories told that perhaps wouldn't have been greenlit in the past. And there's a lot of excitement. You open up the piece with a kind of case study of the writer behind the hit Apple TV show Dickinson. But even in this kind of like golden age where the money is flowing in, the deal for writers seems to be kind of declining anyway. So there's a kind of opportunity, but it seems that according to the piece, writers are expected to do more and more free labor for their shows.
Right, and that's the problem because it's an industry that people want to get into. There will always be people able to work in pretty poor conditions, which is less true of mining, for example. That's just or logging, incredibly dangerous jobs. So you get that problem. And another thing that happened is you get the shortening of episode orders, because when you're thinking about streaming TV, a lot of streamers think that there's more value in another tile on their service, i.e. another show, than, for example, making a second season of a show that already exists, probably not a gigantic hit. So you get sort of more shows, but I think more analysis remains to be done. Not as roughly, I would guess, or maybe even less in some cases, the same number of episodes being made. So even though there's more television shows, my supposition, I didn't include this in the article because more work needs to be done, roughly the same number of episodes, let's say, continues to exist. So that will naturally drive down writers' prices, because you build value in Hollywood by working on the same show over time. You advance within the system. That way you get more money as the show goes on and writers become more integral to the project as a whole. So that also pushes writers' quotes, what they earn, down.
You describe as a kind of a consequence of this, more conservative moves being made by the industry, such as retreating into franchises. I think you quote the writer and producer Zach Stintz as saying, "Hollywood is based on giving audiences what they might not know, and any attempt to drive out risk of that process is sooner or later doomed to failure." What do you see as the future of the writing industry with the rise of AI and the complete restructuring of the writer's room as we know it?
Yeah, so I mean, Hollywood has been really chasing IP, one could argue, throughout its entire history, but really the modern process begins in the 70s. This is one of the consequences of New Hollywood. First, you get Jaws, I believe in 75, which is an incredible IP machine. And then really you get Star Wars in 77, which shows how much money you can make from extra filmic processes like merchandise, for example. And so Hollywood has been chasing that from the mid-1970s, and you get gigantic hits like Batman in 1989, which is when these emergent conglomerates really use all parts of their business structure to push a movie. And then this continues: Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, The Hunger Games, Twilight series. So this is something that's been going on for a very long time. And there's work done by scholars like Shauna Kidman, who I believe is at UC San Diego, that just shows that there's a much larger percentage of films that are part of franchises today than there were in the past. Also, Andrew DeWard, who I quoted extensively in the article, who has a wonderful book coming out called Derivative Media that I think anyone interested in this subject should examine, shows, I forget the exact numbers, but this is broadly correct, how in the late 1980s, 40% of the box office produced by the top 100 films in the domestic box office was produced by original ideas. And today that number in the late 2010s is something like 6%. So a total move away from originality and original ideas. So that's going to actually obviously have some limitations on creativity to a certain degree. But in terms of the future of the writing profession, I think it'll become pretty much like journalism and academia, that if you have other jobs or other incomes, or if you come from a wealthy family, you'll be able to pursue it. But basically, if you're not in that situation, if you don't have another source of income, if you don't have access to independent wealth, it's going to be very difficult to make it as a writer, which is true journalism, magazine writing, academia. Kind of all the same. So you see the destruction of the creative professions that, as a result of the Fordist compromise of the mid-century, for a few decades provided middle-class life to people. That's probably a thing of the past.
So that's a pretty grim assessment of the state of affairs of the writing industry. So you see this as really as kind of part of a broader process in our economy, which is basically transforming these creative jobs. Obviously, the article focuses on film and television, into not careers for regular people, but it becomes a gig economy, and it becomes something really that only rich people can indulge in.
Yep, that's precisely right. It'll return to sort of pre-modern form. Maybe some people will find their Medici. Maybe some people will somehow, I mean, by not rich people, will somehow find their way into the system. But it's going to be, for the people of means.
Well, Dr. Bessner, thank you for taking the time for talking to us today at Talking History. The article we've been talking about is Life and Death of Hollywood, published in Harper's Magazine. And that's all we have time for this month, but remember, you can listen to this episode as well as our back catalog as a podcast available on the KSMU website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Djene Badgelan.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
And you've been listening to Talking History.